In this section of the course, we're going to be looking at some of the foundational thinkers in sociology. Of course, we're doing that throughout, but I'm picking these two because they're just they're sort of pillars of what we now call sociology, and that is Emile Durkheim and Max Weber. And many of you will already be familiar with these two thinkers in my experience teaching. I often have students from a variety of backgrounds: psychology, history, anthropology, sociology, English, and they've heard of them along the way. And so I do want to spend a certain amount of time talking about some of their key concepts in depth. And I think there's many reasons why I'm emphasizing their importance, but probably the key one is related to what I was talking about earlier, that my real question is, are these theories generative? It's not, are they interesting or internally coherent? Can you actually apply them to the world around us? And what we can see, and I'll be showing you, is that both Durkheim and Weber continue to generate huge amounts of research in a variety of fields. And so we'll be starting out by looking at Durkheim, who comes out of the sort of the French school, very directly linked to Auguste Comte and all of those earlier social theorists. And also then we were looking at Weber, who comes from the German tradition. So in doing it this way, we also get a sense of these two schools within European sociology. As I said, I'm going to start with Durkheim. As somebody who studies religion, it's pretty difficult to avoid Emile Durkheim. And in fact, I use his theories all the time in my teaching and in my own research. And he had a lot to say about religion, and it's interesting to see that he himself, from what we can gather, was not particularly religious, but he certainly came from a religious milieu, as did a number of the philosophers that we were talking about last time. So his own personal experiences are also very important in terms of understanding what his preoccupations are. And as we talked about, sociology, when it's good, is always responding to what's going on around it. And so we see with Emile Durkheim, as with Weber, he's a great humanitarian, very concerned about the well-being of society and very concerned with the way that the rapid changes within society were impacting people. As I said, it is important to understand Durkheim from within his own context, both his background and the time period in which he was born. And so he was born in France into a family of modest means in 1858, and his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all rabbis, and from what I can glean, it was assumed that he too would become a rabbi. But Durkheim was born at a time when Jews in Europe were increasingly assimilating into society as a result of changes in laws brought about under Napoleon. And so the idea of opening up universities and property ownership and so on across Europe. And so as a result, we see Durkheim had a lot more choice. And so he went on to study philosophy. And in 1882 he graduated, and in 1887 was appointed to teach social sciences and pedagogy at the University of Bordeaux. And he married and had two children, and his doctoral thesis was called On the Division of Social Labor. So he wrote a number of very influential books and articles, and I will be talking about those in a moment. So according to the information available, he was very concerned to create sociology as a separate discipline, so to separate it out from philosophy, and he was very engaged with sociological methodology. He eventually became chair of the science of education at the Sorbonne, so the most prestigious university in France, and he became a full professor in 1913. And this became formally came to include the study of sociology. So we see with Durkheim, we're going to see this with Weber as well, that he was extremely politically involved throughout his life. He was interested in Marxism, although he didn't adhere to it. He was a founding member of the Human Rights League, and he defended Alfred Dreyfus during the Dreyfus Affair. And so the Dreyfus Affair is one of those watershed events, particularly in France, but really in the Western world. Because, as I said, there was the sense in which, in countries like Germany and France, that the Jewish population was integrating and assimilating. However, with the Dreyfus Affair, in which a military officer was unjustly accused and tried, it became evident that anti-Semitism was still very common in Europe, and obviously, we know the history that follows. So Durkheim becomes very aware that for Jews in France, there's still a lot of limitations. And at the same time, this is influencing people like Herzl, who go on and found contemporary Zionism, which results in the foundation of the State of Israel eventually. So these sort of currents within society are having profound impacts across the board. So in Durkheim's case, increasingly as he gets older, he becomes interested in religion. We'll be looking at his final work, which was on religion, and one that's very, very influential. And I don't think it's that surprising. Typically, people become more interested in religion as they get older, but I think considering the time period he was living in, he lived through various sort of forms of government within France, because France was very destabilized by the French Revolution and kept coming up with different forms of government which would then crash. And so he was experiencing this, and I think it made him not socially conservative, but aware of the way that sudden change and shock can impact people in society. So according to the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the reception of Durkheim's work is muted, quote unquote. I have no idea where they're getting that from. And this is something perplexing to me as I've gone through my career, that with both Weber and Durkheim, there are many people that dismiss them out of hand, despite the very concrete evidence of how many people they've influenced. So I don't know what that's about. I've speculated on it. I have my own dark suspicions that it might have to do with the fact that they both took religion seriously, and that's not, certainly within sociology until recently, was not considered. There was that ongoing idea of the secularization hypothesis, as I discussed earlier, and we'll go into further when we get to that section of the course. So I don't know why, but there is a very strange overall attitude to Durkheim. And again, I don't know why, but we know that he influenced numerous people, including his own nephew, Marcel Mauss, who went on to become one of the most influential anthropologists. And he's influenced almost all of the sociologists that follow, at least in some way. So one of the things that is influential in his work is his claim that religion and other social sort of institutions can be studied, what he called scientifically. So again, drawing on that idea of Auguste Comte. So we can study elements of society like morality and religion as they're part of the natural world and can be studied in this way. And so he talks about the idea of social facts. So a social fact, as defined in his work, is a category of facts which present very special characteristics. They consist of manners of acting, thinking, feeling external to the individual, which are invested with a coercive power by virtue of which they exercise control over him. So this is the idea. So Durkheim is taking seriously, like Martineau, how these structures impact the individual, and they come right down into daily life and structures of feeling, the way people act, the things they believe. And so you can see very clearly why this would be very important within the study of religion. Because as I say, when I'm teaching religion, often people think religion is about belief people hold in their head, but it's much more a sort of a cultural way of acting, believing, thinking, and feeling. And I'll talk about that more as we move along. And so Durkheim took this very seriously. And again, he was very concerned about the ways in which religion led to social cohesion, and if you remove religion, as he was seeing in France, what happens, and the potential dangers of that. And again, I think this may be why he gets the reaction he does sometimes. So we see his three of his main works here: the division of labor in society, suicide, and the elementary forms of religious life. So I'm going to go through each and just highlight some of the key ideas. So in his work, The Division of Labor in Society, Durkheim offers an overview of social institutions and how societies function. So this is his overarching preoccupation in all of his work. And so Durkheim developed the idea of the importance of social solidarity, and this has been one of his most influential ideas. And of course, coming from sociology, he's concerned with the group, not just the individual. And this has proved to be, if anything, even more important in the contemporary period for researchers, because we're living in a time of a tremendous breakdown in social solidarity. And so he developed the idea of this social solidarity as having two forms. And so the first one is mechanical solidarity, which connects the individual to society without any intermediary. So this is typical of societies such as subsistence societies or hunter-gatherer societies. And again, I want to stay away from words like primitive, but this idea of societies that don't have these complex layers of bureaucracy and institutions. And so according to Durkheim, members of societies like this have a natural solidarity. They don't have to work for it because they're all doing the same things. They're sharing all these things in common, and they share the same belief system. So it's much easier to create social solidarity in these kind of societies. And I would just use an example. I've often have students that come from small towns. I've had students that came from towns that were like 5,000 people. Or even if we just look at Nipissing University, for instance. We can see very quickly that it's much easier to have a sense of community and connection to people in smaller groups. It's just natural. So one student I had, she basically knew every single person in her town. And so everybody knew what everybody was doing, knew their families, etc. So mechanical solidarity is a kind of innate solidarity that would have existed prior to the Industrial Revolution, for instance. So the next type of solidarity is organic solidarity, which is found in complex societies and is based on performing specialized functions and interdependence rather than similarity. So organic solidarity is more challenging. It takes more effort, and we can see it in societies such as our own, that the elements that hold society together are less obvious a lot of the time. People do very different jobs. They have different income levels. They're often living in their own little bubble. And we've seen that social media, if anything, has just exacerbated this situation. So it'd be interesting to think about what Durkheim would think about our world right now. Because if anything, it's broken down into its smallest parts as a result of those forces of social mobility and the Industrial Revolution and technology and so on. So he was very concerned with social solidarity. He saw this as absolutely essential, as I'll be getting to when we look at his next work. And he recognized that in societies like ours, it takes a lot more effort to ensure that people have that feeling of solidarity. And so this became one of his central preoccupations. In preparing for this lecture, I came across a number of different articles, very recent, that use Durkheim's theories to look at contemporary events. And interestingly, a number of them were using his theories drawn from his works to look at society during COVID and post-COVID. So we find this one from 2023, Why We Gather, a new look empirically documented at Emile Durkheim's theory of collective assemblies and collective effervescence. So some of you may have heard of this concept of collective effervescence. And so this article is written obviously at a time when we're just moving out of the isolation of COVID, and where we all sort of participated in this vast psychological experiment around the world, and people were very, very isolated. And I think, not that anybody would have wanted wish for that kind of proof, but it many researchers and just people looking around could see that it was very bad for people's psychological health. People couldn't celebrate together. They couldn't mourn together. These are very human things that were taken for granted. And so, so this idea of gathering and its importance is looked at in this article. So I've pulled the abstract here. And so they write, for Durkheim, individual survival and well-being rest on cultural resources and social belonging that must be revived periodically and in collective assemblies. Okay, so they're basically saying, as human beings, we need to gather periodically to for our survival and well-being. It's that important. This isn't some kind of luxury. Durkheim's concern was to clarify how these assemblies achieve this revitalization. An intensive examination of primitive, excuse that language, led him to identify successive levels of engagement experienced by participants and develop explanatory principles relevant to all types of collective gatherings. Okay, they're using very academic language here. So I often just ask students, have you, I think almost everybody in the world has experienced this in some form. So the idea of collective effervescence is that kind of, often it's called the oceanic feeling. So if you've been to certain kinds of concerts or powwows or music events in a group, you can often have this experience where you kind of lose that sense of self. It's a very joyful, liberating feeling of sort of being able to move outside oneself. And this is often a key part of religion, is to achieve this through ritual and ceremony. I'm trying to think of an example. I think probably one that's more recent is the latest championship with the Blue Jays, and watching the way people were in the stands, and I think that was very clearly collective effervescence, the kind of joy and sadness that they were all sharing as a group, as though they were just one kind of entity. So in this article, they recognize that this conception is being widely referred to nowadays. So we're seeing, as I said, that Durkheim, if anything, is becoming more and more relevant. So it says, however, the question of its empirical status remains open. So we extracted from his text his main statements and translated them into research questions. We then examined each question in relation to current theories and findings. So what they're doing is taking what for some people seems to kind of humanities and applying it and using surveys and statistics and so on to look at it. So it's very interesting for me to see the way that this material is now being investigated, sort of to see if it is in fact applicable. And in the articles that I've been looking at, they've all concluded that it is. One of the central ideas that emerges from Durkheim's work is the theory of anomie, and some of you will likely, if you've been in my classes, you'll know this word, and probably have heard it in other classes. And this is the idea of being without a nomos. So it's taken from the Greek. So it represents a breakdown of social norms, values, and expectations within a society. So this idea, Durkheim, again, was looking at his society and what was going on around him, and recognized that his society was changing very, very rapidly. And even when change is sort of for the good, seems to be for the good, it nonetheless is very destabilizing. And so what happens when we have these forces, it can cause states of anomie, according to him. And so I've talked about this a lot in my classes, that it often seems to me that when people develop theories, it's like they've never met a human. And so certainly within religious studies, it's generally recognized that human beings require a sense of meaning and purpose to function. They also require a set of expectations, and this is something that I think has really been lost. And in almost all my classes, I ask my students, what is an adult? Do in our society, do we even have any paradigms of what we expect from adults? Because we're seeing this phenomenon increasingly of what's been called failure to launch, and I would argue that it comes from lack of clarity around expectation, because human beings don't come into the world knowing these things. Their society teaches it to them, and I find there's a very startlingly naive attitude that people have, that people just raise themselves. They don't. We know what happens when people aren't socialized. So I've given this example. I'll just give an example from Italy. So this has become such a concern in Italy that they've actually discussed it on the floors of parliament, and it's particularly young men who are not leaving home. They're not forming relationships. They're not starting families. They're just staying with their family, their birth families. And so if we look at this individually or individualistically, and this is certainly a reaction I've often had from people if I did bring up this topic, is, well, so what? People should be allowed to do what they want. Well, okay. But what if 20% of your population decides they're not going to participate in society? You're rapidly heading for a problem, because all societies depend on people moving into these key roles. They have to become plumbers and lawyers and medical doctors and mothers and fathers and farmers and all of these roles that require a fully functioning adult human being. And it's very demanding. And it strikes me as very strange that we have just left this as an open question. And I think as a result, not all, of course, but growing numbers of young people are struggling. So it occurs when individuals feel disconnected and alienated from social norms. I would argue in our time period, those social norms aren't clear. So even if somebody wanted to be connected to them, they're just not clear, resulting in feelings of aimlessness, disorientation, and moral confusion. So I think we can definitely see this is happening around us. And I know that Durkheim wouldn't have been happy about how prophetic he was in developing this idea. So anomie can be caused by social factors, including unemployment, rapid social change, and cultural shifts. And so I would use an example, sort of a current example, would be kind of the manosphere that we're seeing online. And I would argue I could use a Durkheimian model for this to say these are people that are feeling anomie and they're looking for some kind of structure and advice. And so many of them are turning to online influencers, unfortunately. And I had a student in my class last term write on anomie and incels, for instance, and the way that these are very kind of bleak answers to these very extreme and very quick cultural shifts that people have been experiencing. So it's also related to the rise of right-wing movements, because if nothing else, a lot of them offer clarity. And so I think it shouldn't be surprising that if we're not going to offer people social norms, values that they can attach to, then they're going to go looking for them elsewhere, and this can get very dysfunctional. So Durkheim believed that this was a very dangerous state for human beings to be in for any prolonged length of time. And so he believed that anomie was dangerous both for the individual and their own psychological health, so they can fall into states of depression, become unable to function. If you think life is meaningless, there's absolutely no reason to get out of bed in the morning. There's no reason to get a job. There's no reason to do work of art, to start a family, any of these things. He also believed that in its extreme forms, anomie could be dangerous for society, because a truly anomic person has no sense of social norms, and so they can actually move into criminality, for instance, because they don't see the reason why they should be limited by these artificial rules. So for him, this is a growing and very important problem that needs needs to be addressed. Durkheim's book Suicide, published in 1897 in French and then translated into many languages, is one of the most influential texts emerging from sociology. And he combines here, he does statistical research looking at deaths by suicide in France, but he also interprets it. So he combines qualitative and quantitative sociology in a way that is quite rare these days. And so what he did was he analyzed the difference in the statistics between Protestants and Catholics. So this is interesting because obviously many of you will know that suicide is considered a sin in all forms of Christianity. But what he found was that Protestants are much more likely to commit suicide than Catholics. So when you're looking at research, that becomes your research question. That's just leaping out at you. Why would that be the case? Even though they're both Christians, why would that be the case, that it's so significant? And he actually found that Jews had an even lower suicide rate than Catholics. So he began to look at what could be the causes of this. So alongside with this, he found that suicide was less common among women than men, more common among single people than among those who were partnered, and less common among those who have children. And so what he developed and gleaned from this was that a person who was socially integrated was much less likely to commit suicide. And so he developed a typology of suicide, one of which was anomic suicide, so building out from his concept of anomie. So he believed that this sense of disconnection from society and a feeling of not belonging resulted from weakened social cohesion, and this could lead in very extreme cases to suicide. And so what was so groundbreaking about this work was that up until this point, suicide would generally have been, first of all, hugely stigmatized in society, but it would have been considered a personal weakness. Or lack of character or something of that sort. But what Durkheim did was put it in the context of social forces, and saw that these social forces could impact the individual into their most intimate life. So he wasn't just interested in this as an interesting idea. He wanted to look at how this could be used to prevent suicide. So again, I wanted to look at a contemporary article that applies Durkheim's theories in the present day. This one was written by American and Canadian academics. The Canadian sociologist is from the University of British Columbia. And so the social roots of suicide, theorizing how the external social world matters to suicide and suicide prevention. So you can see they're taking this directly from Durkheim's work. And so the abstract says, the past 20 years have seen dramatic rises in suicide rates in the United States and other countries around the world. These trends have been identified as a public health crisis. So again, I don't think Durkheim would have been happy that we're needing to use his work. As I've said, he was a great humanist, but unfortunately, it remains extremely relevant. As we've seen a variety of mental health crises in many countries in the Western world. So we're increasingly looking at this as a societal problem instead of an individual failing, which was definitely Durkheim's view of it. So they go on to say, we are in urgent need of new solutions and have spurred significant research efforts to improve our understanding of suicide and strategies to prevent it. Unfortunately, despite many significant contributions to the founding of sociology through Émile Durkheim's classic Suicide, sociology's role has been less prominent in contemporary efforts to address these tragic trends. So again, we're seeing this clearly related to that muted acceptance of Durkheim's work. So it's only now that we're fully engaging with his work. I think this is also related to our attitudes to the body and health, and I think that our models of addiction have often framed, for instance, death by overdose as a strictly physical issue. So it's only now that we're starting to see Durkheim's theoretical framework being applied. consistently to things like suicide. So again, these researchers want to take these theories and apply them and look at the efficacy of suicide prevention using these theories. So if we were to follow it logically, that would mean, how do we shore up social cohesion and integration in society? Because this is what Durkheim believed was what kept people from these anomic reactions. And certainly Durkheim recognized that religion traditionally had played this role within societies of creating social cohesion, meaning, symbolic languages, and so on. And so, despite the fact that he himself apparently was not particularly religious, he recognized the danger of what happens when we lose religion. And this is a question that I have asked. And again, I find people treat it very dismissively, which is to say, okay, you're getting rid of religion as they did during the French Revolution, but what are you replacing it with if it's playing this vital role within society? And I think we're only beginning to look at that realistically. And in my introduction to religious studies, I look at the work of Alain de Botton, who's an atheist philosopher. And I feel he's a kind of in the lineage of Durkheim in the contemporary world. So he wrote a book called Religion for Atheists. So he's basically arguing you don't have to be religious, but you need to learn from religion, because religion is very good at certain things. And one of those things is creating community. And so certainly this would apply to any of these kind of dysfunctional forms of anomie, right? Of mitigating things like alienation, isolation, and so on. So I suspect you're starting to recognize why, for instance, when I was doing my graduate work in religious studies, we look at a lot of Durkheim, and he increasingly becomes interested in religion. Again, his biography is important. I think he was seeing the writing on the wall. I talked already about the Dreyfus Affair, but unfortunately, he lived to see World War I, and his own son died in 1916, and so he himself passed away very shortly after. So he himself was living through the tragedy of his time, and I think he was recognizing all of these social forces that had been unleashed by modernity, and so another one of his most important books is The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. And this definitions of religion, there's many, but this is the one I come back to again and again. And it's partly because he recognizes the importance of what it means for the group, that religion isn't just about individuals, it's about societies and cultures and groups. So his definition is, a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. So if we swap out the word church for synagogue or mosque or any other religious community, this still makes sense. So the power of this definition rests in the fact that it is the recognition that religions are these complex systems, and they include belief and practice. So that's ritual, ceremony, sacred objects. And so, as I was talking about theories that are generative, so this definition really allows you to build out into a variety of the aspects of religion. And so, again, looking at the world around him, he's very aware that religions, not all of them obviously, but most of them are very successful at creating tight-knit communities. And this has very important implications in a variety of ways. When I look at this in my health and healing course, we know now through extensive research that people who have community are healthier mentally, physically, and they live longer. And so this isn't just some nice thing to have. This is something that's absolutely vital for human well-being. Another aspect of Durkheim's work that makes it so profound, in my opinion, is that he offers these very visionary, kind of overarching views of the topics that he's looking at. He doesn't get caught up in the minutiae and the details. He looks at statistics, but he doesn't get caught up in them. He's looking for meaning and pattern. And so, when he's looking at religions, he starts to look at what they have in common. And he develops this framework that's been very influential in religious studies, in anthropology and sociology, which is the idea of the sacred and the profane. So he writes, all known religious beliefs present one common characteristic. They presuppose a classification of all things real and ideal of which men think into two classes or opposed groups, generally designated by two distinct terms, which are translated well enough by the words profane and sacred. Okay, now this may seem self-evident, but it actually isn't. And so this is often my experience. People will say, yes, religion creates community. So somebody could just belong to, a soccer team, or they could belong to a book reading club, and that would be fine. And it is, it's good. It's very helpful. But there's something that only religion brings to the table, which is the idea of the sacred. And so this is where we move into mysticism and so on, and sort of more symbolic ways of thinking. And so Durkheim takes this very seriously. I don't have any insight into what his own beliefs were at the end of his life, but certainly coming from a Jewish family, a family of rabbis, he would have been very well aware of this, of the difference between a religious worldview and a secular worldview. And the idea that for religious people, certain things are sacred, and so they're held in the highest regard, which renders it something different than profane. And so a religious community will be different than a secular community. And as I said, that's not to say secular community isn't important. And I've always believed that the more communities people have, the better. So if they have a soccer club and something religious and something university life, all of these things are good. There's no reason why anyone has to pick. So I think this is a very important way of demarcating what makes religion different than secular worldviews.